Hello, everybody. Welcome. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land from which I join you today, Mianjin. On behalf of the University of Queensland, I pay our respects to the Yugara and Turrbal peoples, their ancestors and their descendants, and their enduring cultural and spiritual connections to country. I would like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands from which each of you are joining us today. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Welcome, everybody, to the first lecture in the 2025 People, Plants and the Law online lecture series. My name is Shruti Balaji, and I'm very pleased to introduce you all to the 2025 installment of the series. One of the aims of the series is to bring together personal historical reflections from a group of the most important figures working on people, plants, and the law. Another aim is to showcase some of the best work currently happening in the area. 2025 marks the fourth year of the People, Plants, and the Law series, and you can find all the recordings from previous year's lectures on the series website, and that is where the recordings from this year's lectures will also be uploaded. If you do have any questions for our speakers, please post them in the comments, and we'll do our best to come to them after the talk. So turning to today's lecture, we are showcasing again some of the most exciting and interesting work being undertaken in the space from not one, but three very impressive scholars. Dr. Daniela Soleri is currently a research scientist in the Department of Geography at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Alma Piñeyro Nelson is a biologist in the Department of Agriculture and Animal Production at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Xochimilco in Mexico City, and Dr. Emmanuel González Ortega, who is also currently a researcher at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Xochimilco in Mexico City. Together, the expertise of our speakers spans a huge number of areas, from ethnoecology, epistemic justice in food systems, molecular genetics of plant development, agrobiodiversity, conservation, the regulation, biosafety, and biosecurity of genetically modified organisms, plant biotechnology, and synthetic biology, to name but a few. Our speakers have undertaken work that looks at scientists and researchers, small-scale farmers, smallholder producers, and peasants from across Mexico, indigenous and local communities, all the way to the government and United Nations level. We are delighted to have such an incredible group of speakers who cover the entire spectrum of people, plants, and the law to kick off the 2025 series. Today, Daniela, Alma, and Emmanuel will be speaking to us on the experiences of scientists supporting community engagement regarding crop genetic resources and the law, examples from traditionally based maize systems in North America. This seminar explores the global significance of in situ conserved crop genetic resources, native and local crop varieties developed and maintained by peasant or farming communities, including indigenous communities. These crop varieties and the associated ancestral knowledge have led to the construction of legal frameworks around access, use, benefit sharing, liability and redress, and threats to the integrity and conservation of these crop varieties and the associated ancestral knowledge. Until recently, many of these frameworks have tended to support an industrial agriculture and food system paradigm. Our speakers will share their experiences working with indigenous maize-growing communities around these core issues, highlighting both challenges of exploitation and the development of grassroots collaborative approaches to protect these resources. Their reflections offer important lessons for current and future research and practice around the interface of the legal, Western, scientific, and community perspectives on native and local crop varieties. I will now hand over to Daniela to take us away.
Thank you so much, Shruti. That was a great and detailed introduction. So I will dive right in, and I want to place our talk today in the larger context, and that is that the industrial agri-food system is a major contributor to the Anthropocene crises that we are all experiencing, and this is pretty well documented. However, assumptions of that system continue to guide research focus, resource allocation, and legal frameworks, for example, privatization, assumptions such as privatization, commercialization, concentration, and the externalization of negative impacts. These assumptions also include ones about indigenous and local communities' rights in their crop genetic resources. And these have typically been that these agri-food systems are obsolete. They could be sources of genetic resources, and there are no intellectual property rights in these systems. And here is a quote that sort of represents that perspective by one of the most influential social scientists working in the late 20th century in this area. Uncollected and uncharacterized genetic resources have not been conceived of as intellectual property by farmers or collectors, that is, until they enter the formal system. And technical assistance may be seen as a form of indirect compensation for those resources. So luckily, things have been changing, and there has been increasing recognition that these communities have rights in their crop genetic resources. And that has changed in the direction of explicit inclusion of fairness and equity in international agreements, which I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with over the past several decades. But I would argue that the assumptions of the dominant agri-food system still prevail. And we see this in our own work with indigenous maize systems in North America, which have unique significance as being in the center of origin, domestication, diversity for this crop, and also the contemporary foundation of rural livelihoods in the area. So we want to present briefly two cases where we feel that legal structures have failed to support the rights of indigenous maize farmers in this region. And those are their rights to control their crop genetic resources and also thereby strengthening their own communities. We describe our experiences working with communities, but importantly, we do not speak for them. So there will be two examples. The first is about controlling exploitation in terms of access and benefit sharing. And the second about controlling contamination in terms of agricultural biosafety in the form of community biosafety. So in terms of setting the stage for controlling exploitation and ABS agreements, I think it's very good to look at a current example as a background, and that is the case of Oloton maize in Oaxaca, Mexico, a southern state of Mexico. And this is a very desirable maize that a public-private partnership of universities and industry in the US was very interested in accessing this maize variety for commercial breeding of a very valuable trait, nitrogen fixation. And they followed the Nagoya Protocol. They have an internationally recognized certificate of compliance. But the perception amongst, for example, indigenous nonprofits in the region is that this has simply been an act of biopiracy. And there are many details and many issues with this entire relationship. And I give a couple of references there where you can find out much more about them. But most importantly for this case study is that the case followed the Nagoya Protocol, which creates a strong basis for greater legal certainty and transparency for both providers and users of the resources, as well as provisions for establishing more predictable conditions for access to genetic resources. So basically, this is supporting the existing system of obtaining genetic resources for commercialization, privatization, and commercialization. And while this Oloton case recognized community rights in these resources, they did so in a minimal transactional manner and encouraged municipal authorities to do the same. And they ignored the biological and sociocultural reality of the agri-food system. And I would argue that the protocol itself created conflict and arguably undermined the existing agri-food system. So what about, instead of starting with the protocol, what about starting with the community instead? So I'm going to give you a quick example of a very early collaboration with Zuni maize farmers. The Pueblo of Zuni is located in what is now western New Mexico in the United States. They have been agriculturalists for a very long time, and they, like all native populations, have undergone tremendous historic trauma and loss of land and all sorts of resources. This is a very small community. A lot of poverty is present, and it's a very challenging agricultural environment. So for 3 years, I worked on 2 projects housed at the Pueblo of Zuni's conservation program, the Zuni Sustainable Agriculture Project and the Zuni Folk Varieties Project. And the goal of both of those was to support the Zuni people's revitalization of their own agriculture and use of traditional crop varieties. So people were noticing more and more things out in the world that had their name on it: Zuni corn chips, Zuni cornmeal, Zuni bean seeds, things like this. And they were bewildered and they were angry. They were pissed off because those things had nothing to do with the Zuni people. So we asked, as a project, how can community members' concepts and values about global issues, for example, access and benefit sharing? Although this was 1993, I had no idea what access and benefit sharing were. But it was very much along those lines. How can those kind of global issues be the starting point of discussion? And so we conducted a survey in 1993. And we had 3 groups that were sampled. One was an irrigation unit made up of Zuni farmers. Another was the Zuni Tribal Council, elected men. And the last was the Zuni Cultural Resources Advisory Team. These are recognized, respected, elder, male Zuni religious cultural leaders whose work is to ensure that activities are consistent with Zuni culture and values. So we created scenarios together with our Zuni farmer colleagues. And these scenarios are basically the idea of creating locally relevant presentation of fundamental global issues. And each scenario had 4 described responses and also the option to create another response. We had 4 scenarios. I'll tell you very briefly about 2 of them today. And the responses were given for the irrigation unit and the tribe through anonymous voting. And for the resources advisory team, they had discussions amongst themselves and released consensus statements. So the advisory team had one basic overview statement for the entire process, and that was that Zuni seeds should not be sold or given to outsiders for profit, breeding, resale, or trademarking because of their significance to the Zuni people. And you can see a little excerpt of a very important creation story. And once you let something as important as these seeds go, you just don't know how they will be used. So they pointed out that they will continue to keep these cultural values central, but that they will also try and reflect practical, actual choices that the Zuni people are needing to make. Am I cutting the slide off? Is the slide cut off? No. Okay. So this is the first scenario. It's about Zuni maize seed for commercial breeding. And this is the way it was presented to all of these participants. Ed Jones, a scientist with Better Seeds International, a large seed company, visits Zuni in October to collect seeds of traditional blue and white maize. His company is looking for maize varieties that are resistant to drought so they can use them in breeding programs to develop commercial maize varieties that Better Seeds would then sell. He drives around the fields and stops to talk with farmers while they're harvesting maize. And this is something very real that's been happening at least since the early 1900s in the US. And here's an example of a collection held by the USDA. So the first of the 4 possible given responses is by farmer Ethel. And she says, she offers to sell him 10 ears of white, 10 ears of blue maize for a total of $20. So we can break it out this way to try and understand its impact in terms of access and benefit sharing. The mechanism is private sale. In terms of outsiders' access to Zuni resources, it's limited based on individual sale, and the benefit sharing is private, just one individual, one time. The second farmer, Dan, gives Ed Jones seeds only after Ed signs a contract stating that if Better Seeds ever makes money from the seeds, he will pay Dan a fair share, undefined. So again, a private contract here, limited in terms of sale with an individual, and the benefit sharing will be to Dan conditionally based on use of the material. Jerry refuses to give Ed any seeds, saying that they are a gift of the creator and should not be given to non-Zunis. So there's no access, and benefit sharing is not applicable. And finally, that is defining benefit sharing as from the outside to Zuni. Finally, the fourth farmer, Mary, takes Ed to the tribal council. Together, they agree on a contract between the Zuni and Better Seeds that pays the individual farmer for the seeds and gives the tribe a share of any profits made in the future based on the use of those seeds. So we have a different mechanism, a tribal contract. There is relatively limited access through this group contract, and the benefits of payment go to private individuals and also conditionally in the future to the group, to the tribe. So you can see those four different possible responses. And the important thing to notice here with the votes given by the farmers and the tribal council is, first of all, no one liked the idea of just a one-time private sale and giving away the seed. Secondly, there is a vast difference between the majority of farmers preferring the third option, refusing to give any seed, and the majority of the tribal council preferring a tribal contract. And then the advisory team pointed out that they do not support crossbreeding. It's inappropriate for Zuni farming. And we know that these characteristics of our crops are desirable for making money that Zuni never receives. So we should be given recognition and compensation to Zuni for past, present, and future use of any of our crops in breeding. So the second scenario I will go through very quickly. It was a similar type of arrangement, only this time we were talking about maize grain for commercial sale. And we had these different farmers representing different mechanisms, different forms of access, and different forms of benefit sharing. And again, it's important to note the difference between the tribal council and the farmers themselves. And it's also, I think, important to notice that while there are direct issues in terms of accessing seeds for the variety, people are also interested in other kinds of benefits. So you're getting a lot more people voting for selling cornmeal, which doesn't risk losing any viable seed, but opens up a larger market to the farmers hoping to get a little bit of income. And then the resources advisory team said that Zuni community needs more traditional foods like blue maize. So if sales are considered as a response to this need, it would all depend on, first of all, who is selling, if the farmers themselves were selling, or if middle people were selling, and in that case, the Zuni can lose control of the seeds. It also depends on who is buying. Their neighbors, the Hopi, with whom they have shared and exchanged seeds for centuries, or Anglos who have many times used Native American seeds, foods, or tribal names for their own profit. They preferred the idea of an independent community-based group like a community seed bank that could buy farmers' surplus, resell it in the community as a service and not for profit, and work with the advisory team to support Zuni cultural values. So just to conclude, my observation from the Oloton example, comparing it with the experience with Zuni, is that despite their intent to support communities' rights in their genetic resources, the protocols can serve the status quo, ignoring local knowledge, and they can create conflict within communities, conflict that we saw represented in the differences between tribal council and farmers' values, for example. Scenarios are one way to frame those issues in locally relevant terms that can document the concepts and values in a community, and they might be one way to contribute to protocols that could help communities instead of destroying them. So, on to Emmanuel.
Thank you, Daniela. And well, as Daniela already explained, the combination of factors such as territory, which are rich in biological diversity or broad cultural diversity, in addition to geoclimatic factors, have been essential for in the domestication of crops and their diversification. Currently, many crops are an essential part of the human diet. In the Mesoamerican region, present day, the southern of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, this factor combined with to give rise to crops such as corn, beans, squash, chili peppers, and more. The next one, please, Daniela. So, um, uh, as the years pass and commercial plant biotechnology has taken step in agriculture, this plant biotechnology has characteristics such as genetic homogeneity of crops, the genetic modification of plants itself, which introduces traits through genetic engineering, such as herbicide tolerance or insect resistance. And another characteristic is that the privatization of agriculture through the seed patent and market concentration, and as well as the widespread use of herbicide. So then all these characteristics, and after 30 years of agricultural biotechnology, also considering that these are living modified organism which or whose genetic behavior or the effect of them on them of the environment or the agroecological settings could not be predicted. That could be anticipated that genetically modified plants could appear beyond the sites that were the first seeds were original planted, these modified seeds. And this has happened over time. Monitoring studies have detected, for example, GMO in regions of Mexico, GMO canola in places like Japan, Canada, or Australia, outside of the permitted sites. The next one, please, Daniela. Gracias. Thank you. In Mexico, there is a genetically modified organism biosecurity law, which was enacted in 2005 and later was amended in 2022. This law defines biosecurity as the set of actions and measures of evaluation, monitoring, control, and prevention related to GMO activities. In order to prevent or avoid or reduce the possible risks that this activity could cause to human health or to the environment and to biological diversity or to animal, plant, or and aquaculture health. So this concept, which is introduced in this law, finally, in the next slide, please, after an assessment of this Mexican law on biosecurity of GMOs, we can see that this law reveals several characteristics that led to the conclusion that this law has flaws that have resulted in harm to the environment and potentially to human health. In a basic sense, the Mexican law is a set of administrative and legal processes aimed at obtaining permits for GMO planting. And if you recall the short phrase from the previous slide, that the definition of biosafety, it mentions ex ante that activities involving GMOs are carried out. So this law is sustaining that activities with GMOs should be conducted without the consideration, for example, and risk assessment studies. Additionally, this law does not define legal or technical processes for conducting risk assessment of GMOs that could potentially be released into the environment. Given that Mexico is a country rich in biodiversity and cultures, primarily indigenous peoples, this consideration should be central to their determining the appropriateness or of obtaining permits for legal planting of GMOs. Mexico is a country characterized by diversity of indigenous people throughout its territory. Here I take a moment to tell you all that we are today celebrating the National Day of Maize in Mexico, which has a profound significance for peoples, which is very, very linked to agricultural practice. For example, the harvest of the first maize crops. So these indigenous people lives in territories where planting permits has been requested. Nevertheless, over time, this requirement has not been adequately fulfilled, resulting in violation of human rights against indigenous people. For example, and I'll take a minute to explain a little more. For example, Mayan peoples, due to the planting of GMOs, soybeans in their territories. Additionally, Mexican biosafety law is outdated because it fails to consider principles adopted in treaties and protocols to which Mexico has been adhered and ratified, which are essential for determining damages and liabilities arising from the use of biotechnology, which we have been through 30 years of this biotechnology in many regions, many territories, not only in Mexico, for example, also in South America, and these damages and liabilities finally are in this frame of international protocols and treaties. Additionally, this biosafety law does not consider or regulate elements related to current biotechnological innovations, which are highly contested given the rapid pace of technical development. For example, artificial intelligence. Digital information on genetic diversity sequences is a subject of international dispute because it involves the patenting of genes, their use without the recognition or compensation to the indigenous peoples from where the resources originally emerged or were created, or the possibility of modifying plant genes using genetic modification techniques, such as genome editing via, for example, CRISPR-Cas, the most recent genetic modification tools. The next one, please. Since the beginning of planting transgenic soy in the Mayan region in the southern of Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula, the people there, Mayan people there, saw how the territory was progressively destroyed and sought the support of people from civil society, lawyers, and concerned and committed scientists to design and engage actions that would allow them to stop the dispossession and contamination of their territories. In the next slide, please. A consequence of this, the Bacalar Maya Indigenous Council was organized, which was a grassroots organization almost composed by Mayan indigenous people, and from the municipality of Bacalar in the southern state of Quintana Roo in the Yucatan Peninsula. And this case is very interesting because there were performed informative sessions to explain, for example, the implication of the presence of GMOs in the territory, as, for example, soybean, but also transgenic maize. Later, there were performed some workshops where for the detection of GMO corn, and additionally, and in a very synchronized manner, some legal strategies were designed that could let this grassroots organization to decide on the territory and to take the best actions for their benefit and stopping the dispersion of transgenes. In the next one, please. So here is a poster of one of the events, of the sessions that were held there in the Mayan territories. And in the next one, please. A very interesting, like a sociological phenomenon was emerged there. A collective of Mayan women from Bacalar and the Calakmul municipalities at the same region in the Yucatan Peninsula was organized. This women organization emerged as a response that let's say the Bacalar Maya Indigenous Council was mainly formed or organized by men, by local men. So women were in the consideration that their voice was not taken into account. So they organized their own group, and they began to discuss how intensive agriculture, which arrived with the settlements of Mennonite population, began to pollute the soil, to destroy the rainforest, and harm the health of the people from Mayan communities due to the excessive use of agrochemicals. So in this like these discussions, some informational meetings were held and guided by local women, and also these sessions were, for example, performed at schools where this somehow like systematization of the gathering of information regarding the status of health of the community, and this was supported and accompanied by sociologists, social anthropologists, and well, some colleagues from the biological sciences. Also, for example, the risk of genetic GMOs were GM corn or GM soybean were explained, and currently this collective of women continues its work in the region, going more, in my appreciation, more deeply understanding the roles and the ethics of care among women and among the old community, thinking that women support in many occasions all the communities, or many of the communities. In the next one, please. In this final slide, you can see some posters of different events held over time between years 2014 and 2016. In short, and as a conclusion, the relationships based on trust, solidarity, mutual support were established between socially committed scientists and people from indigenous communities, not only in the Yucatan Peninsula, but also from Oaxaca, Chiapas, Puebla, Veracruz, many other regions of the country, which has a very close relationship with their crops, with their territory, in two words, indigenous peoples. So the participation both in field and in academic forums seek to strengthen the bridges between society in the face of common problems, albeit in different territories. In the case of agricultural biotechnology and transgenic crops, these efforts have been the foundation of what we now formally call community biosecurity, which in the next intervention, my colleague Alma will explain. Thank you.
Thank you. So as Emmanuel explained previously, the introduction of genetically modified crops into Mexico has generated quite a large debate. In the case of the Yucatan Peninsula, it has been led basically by the Mayan people and the Maya communities that have been struggling against this agricultural proposal that is devastating not only their native forests, but their culture and their means of life. But in Mexico, the crop that has generated the biggest debate across the last 25 years has been maize. And this is very important to stress because Mexico is the center of origin of corn, of maize. It's the center of diversification. It currently holds more than 50% of the genetic variety of the crop worldwide. And very importantly, it's the staple crop of the country. So we eat it every day, everyone. And it is part, as Daniela said earlier, of our cultural identity. And again, it's a very important food crop for us. So why do I give this background is because in 2001, there was this report that was published in a very prestigious journal called Nature, where two researchers that were working in the year 2000 in the Sierra Norte de Juárez, which is in the state of Oaxaca, they were working in something else, and they took some of native maize ears from that part of the country, and they analyzed them for transgene presence, and they came out positive. And this was very surprising at the time because transgenic maize had only been released for commercial planting in the United States in 1996. Meanwhile, in Mexico, there had been a de facto moratorium to sow transgenic maize at any scale since 1998. So finding in a very remote and mountainous part of Mexico where maize agriculture is marginal, let's say basically for self-consumption, it's more a forest-based community, finding native maize that already had transgenes sparked a huge debate that it went aside of a technical or scientific debate, and it involved peasant organizations, farmer organizations, NGOs, environmental NGOs, and scientists. While the debate was trying to be framed as a technical debate, how much transgenes do we have? Are the data by Quist and Chapela, the first report, are they solid? Should they have performed more experiments? Is it likely that we have transgenes in other native maize varieties in Mexico? As it was trying to be framed only as a technical debate, it was really a political debate. It was, since the beginning, it was a political debate. Even among scientists and academics, I should stress that, no? And that had to do with idea of what type of country we wanted and what type of sovereignty over our own genetic resources and culture we wanted. And now we could frame it as a biocultural debate. So anyway, after this first report documenting the presence of transgenes in native maize varieties, this spurred a set of biomonitoring efforts to see if there were other places in the country where we could find native maize varieties that already had transgenes. And as I wanted just to synthesize on the column on the right side of this slide, as you can see, from the year 2000 to the year 2024, almost every year we have had different biomonitoring efforts. I'm only putting the ones that are related with academic biomonitoring efforts that were either published in white papers, in technical reports, in papers, in theses. But we should also, there was also a variety of biomonitoring efforts that were performed by the communities themselves in alliance with academics. And the interesting thing is, as you can see, we have been doing biomonitoring for almost a quarter of a century. And even when we have shown, because both Emmanuel and me have been some of the people involved in actually performing the biomonitoring analysis, well, we have shown that we have pervasive presence of transgenes in different types of maize, native varieties, in foodstuffs, in the grain, of course, that is imported in large quantities from the United States. To date, and even if when we have a biosecurity law that Emmanuel already synthesized what is the core problem with that law, to date we have had no legal actions from competent authorities implemented in trying to address this unwanted transgene presence in native maize seedlots. So after this scenario, the next one, please. As scientists, we who have focused on transgene detection, we've asked ourselves, well, once we detect the presence of transgenes in landrace or native maize varieties, what can individuals and communities that are the owners of this type of native maize, what can they do to contend with this unwanted presence? And in this same line of thought, how can academic knowledge and expertise aid in this process? The next one, please. So for almost 5 years now, we have been, 5 years, we have been trying to explicitly, because it had already been done, as Emmanuel was talking about the case of the Yucatan Peninsula, and also since the 2001 debate when they found transgenes in Oaxaca, there was already a set of scientists that were trying to help with the technical aspects of transgene detection as a means to provide that information to communities, and as a means to, with that information, address the competent authorities to try to get them to do something. So that had been going on for years. What has changed, what has changed in the last years is that now we are thinking more of a bottom-up approach, which is explicitly based on co-constructing alternatives with the communities and trying to generate this type of approaches to community biosafety strategies. And in order to have successful community biosafety strategies, it is fundamental that we consider, all of us involved, not us as academics or scientists themselves, but the actors, the main actors are the communities and the people in the communities themselves. We have to consider the local actors, the local institutions, and what their influence is in the territory, and what are the community practices and capabilities or capacities. The next one, please. So in general terms, what is community biosafety? It's still a term that we are constructing, but we could define it as a range of strategies focused on avoiding, detecting, reducing, and or eliminating the presence of GMOs or their genetically modified elements as a means to conserve not only the environment, the agrobiodiversity, which once again, Mexico is very, very important in the case of maize, and human health, because it's our staple crop, but the ways of life of those who face the risks and problems derived from the presence of GMO elements in their seeds, which are basically peasants from indigenous or mestizo origin and small-scale farmers. Those are the people that day to day, to this date, are the ones that actively conserve the genetic diversity and the biocultural heritage of maize in our country. In order to try to have a community biosafety approach, it needs a multidisciplinary approach and involves, as already Emmanuel talked about it, a dialogue of knowledges. What does a dialogue of knowledges mean? We're talking about interacting and conversing with all the actors involved in this phenomenon and this situation, and taking their knowledge, their traditional knowledge seriously into account, their references seriously into account, and us as scientists and academics trying not to speak for them, or to give them strategies that are not culturally pertinent for their context. The next one, please. So I'm going to present really fast two particular examples of the first explicit community biosafety works that we have been doing in different parts of the country. One was done at the level of a single community, and that's the town of San Agustin Montelobos in Oaxaca. So there's a map of Mexico. We can see in orange the state of Oaxaca, and within the state of Oaxaca, where we see the star, is the Mixteca region of Oaxaca. In this particular place, in a technical study commissioned by the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, which is part of the Environmental Authority of Mexico. After a study commissioned to Elena Alvarez Bulla, we found transgenes in this particular town. No, we found some samples of maize that had been donated from this town that had presence of transgenes. So we had that, and that was in 2018. After that, my master's degree student, Heriberto Vázquez Cardona, I'm going to talk about his work, went back to the community, presented the data, talked to the authorities and to the people in the community, and agreed to do a more in-depth study that considered them from the beginning. The next one, please. So while we had already grown to be pretty good at collecting maize and analyzing for transgene presence at the lab, something that we also wanted to explicitly incorporate in this study was not only the, let's say, the biological or agronomical diagnosis if we have transgenes or not in the community, how many maize seedlots had these transgenes, but also what was the sociocultural and economic situation of this town. So we used a series of tools that are basically used in social sciences, as we made collaborative workshops. We also made, it was made by Heriberto primarily. Also, we did a set of questionnaires to try to ask the people how they managed their maize seedlots. And what we found out is that most of the seed, the provenance of the seed, at least in the 2021 cycle, 2022, came from within the community. Only 8% came from external from the community. But the other interesting thing was that once you had a seed lot in the community, there was a very, very high degree of exchange within the individuals in the community. So they above 97% of people that were asked about it said that they exchanged seeds with their family members, with their friends, no? And when we ask why did they introduce external seed from the community, the basic and the most important situation was seed shortage. We are talking about a place where the parcels are small. It is a place that has, technically, it can have water scarcity every year. And so they contend with seed shortage due to low yield, no yield as a consequence of climate change, soil erosion, and peasant non-renewal. And in some cases, the minority, it was just curiosity. They found a seed that they found interesting in a communitary market, and they would introduce it to see how it fared. Next one, please. So this is a map of San Agustin Montelobos. All the agricultural parcels are mapped into the territory. What we see in green are the parcels where seed was donated, and we analyzed them in the lab, and they were negative for transgene presence. And then the ones that are in red are parcels that had presence of transgenes. The ones in gray were the ones where we weren't able to collect seed, mainly because there was no yield, no? There was no harvest, so people could not donate seed. And the interesting thing about this particular case is that given that it was a relatively small community, we actually made a census. We didn't have to make a sampling. We collected all seed lots. And we could see that there was out of 71 maize samples collected and analyzed in the lab, 8 came out positive. And something that's very interesting is that Heriberto not only did this participatory transects and mapped each of the parcels, but also saw if they had isolation by isolation by greenery, by trees. And there was a particular case, the one that's in the center, it's not very visible here, where you had a positive parcel, it's very narrow, and then you had other ones that were negative. And the interesting thing is that that parcel that came out positive to transgene presence was surrounded by trees. So there was isolation by a physical barrier, and that partly explained why the ones that are just right beside it didn't have transgenes. The next one, please. So with all this data, what we did was to do a diagnosis, do a formal social, economic, and also biological diagnosis, say which seedlots had transgenes, what type of transgenes, what was the practices within the community that could favor or not the dispersal of transgenes. And we gave those results back to the community. And then together with the community, we did workshops, and we provided a set of options of how they could manage the situation, and the people in the community were discussing which were pertinent or not for their context. And something that they settled on was to make a community seed bank, because they have a very high vulnerability to lose their seed when there's a bad situation. Next one, please. We did another work which was implementing community biosafety, but this was at a regional scale. And this was down in the southernmost state of Tabasco, which has border with Guatemala. And here we worked in 22 ejidos. In the map to the right, we can see which are the ejidos we worked with. Next one, please. And again, from the onset, we considered both working in a dialogue of knowledges with the people in this part of the country, no? Why did we find transgenes in this part of the country? It had to do with the reactivation of the milpa polycropping system. This was done by a program, a governmental program. This reactivation was caused by a governmental program called Sembrando Vida, or Sowing Life. That it also, in workshops, previous collaborator found out that some people were saying that they were bringing glyphosate maize from Guatemala, because these are border towns with Guatemala, and they were introducing them to use them because it's easier to manage. So after all this information, we performed a multidisciplinary diagnosis of the economic, social, cultural, and biological and agroecological context of participating ejidos in order to jointly generate a community biosafety protocol. Next one, please. I'm about to finish. So the results, we did find transgenes in all the ejidos that were sampled. It was not we didn't sample as profoundly each ejido. That was depending on seed availability. We also found that many samples were positive to commercial transgenic events, which suggests a recent introduction. And there was a very high occurrence both in native land races and in hybrids. Next one, please. Now, after all the participatory workshops, what we generated together with 3 ejidos that continued the work further with us was a set of a manual or that could help out the community and took into account the input from the community of what they could do to contend with the unwanted presence of transgenic maize in their fields. And we generated a set of popular science materials that here are the first page of those. And what we also found out, and that's when I'm going to finish with the next one, please, is that in Mexico's southern border, cross-border GM maize movement needs a cross-country approach. And derived from this previous investigation in the Tabasco region, in the Tenosique, we together with Lisa Grandia of UC Davis and with Daniela Soleri and Emmanuel, we proposed to this foundation, Alianza MX of the University of California, a binational project that is actually a trinational project, which is trying to strengthen the biosafety of the Mexican south border through the analysis of what is coming in from Guatemala. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Daniela, Emmanuel, and Alma. That was incredible. That was so fascinating to see how much work you've done so far, but also to end on how much work you're planning on doing going forward is just incredible. What a comprehensive presentation. So thank you for that. We still have a little bit of time for questions. So I just want to invite if anybody would like to put any questions in the chat, and I can raise them with our speakers while we still have them. While everybody is collecting their thoughts and putting some questions together, I might just take advantage of being chair here and ask some pressing questions that I had on my mind. I think I just thought, as you mentioned, Daniela, starting off the following law and some of the laws that are in place, like the Nagoya, didn't produce great outcomes for communities. And so, as you went through the presentation, we're now sort of looking at a lot of community and grassroots approaches. Do you think in any of this that there is a place or any work being done to improve or involve any of the legal frameworks, or that could help? Or is it really that we need to focus on the community approach going forward?
Um, well, I think I know there's work on biocultural community protocols, and I think that obviously has some promise. But what I have read thus far has not struck me as prioritizing the interests of the farming communities and their own interests in how they want their agricultural systems and communities to be into the future. So that's why the Oloton case was so striking, and that's what inspired me to actually come and talk about something that was so old, because the mistakes are still being made, and these at the very, very first step, creating inter and intra-community conflict is really, really bad and really damaging, and it sort of unravels from there. And so I think certainly there's a lot of potential with community protocols, but they have to be done with the right priorities and the right participation, in my experience.
Thank you. We've got a question in the chat from Marita. So she's just asked that in the last days, President Sheinbaum announced an expansion of seed bank protections for Mexico's 64 corn varieties. What do these measures imply in practice in terms of institutional capacity, monitoring, funding, and legal backing?
I don't know if Emmanuel wants to answer that one, or
I was about to tell you the same for you. If you want, you can explain, and if needed, I can complement. So go on.
one big discussion in Mexico, and not only in Mexico, in places where you have stand-in genetic diversity of fundamental crops, is how useful it is to keep them in seed banks, like long-term storage and seed banks like we have in Mexico, which we have the worldwide seed bank of maize and wheat, very close to Mexico City, which is CIMMYT. How much that is valuable versus keeping that stand-in genetic diversity in the field. And let's say the most recent genetic analysis suggests that the best strategy to keep that genetic diversity is to keep it live in the field more than to put it in the seed banks. Because once you have seeds that are put into a seed bank, they do not evolve. If you have them frozen or stored for 25 years, those seeds are not contending with for example, challenges to climate change. No? It doesn't mean that they are not valuable. They are valuable resources. Yes, they are. And again, resources in the terms of what Daniela said. No, they are public goods until they come into a seed bank. And once they go into the seed banks, they're property of someone. No? And on the other hand, from the biological point of view, they are not actively evolving because they are not being faced agricultural cycle per agricultural cycle to the challenges of current climate, not the one when they were collected. So I would contend that we have to still see if this announcement by President Sheinbaum is going to translate into real actions in the field, or if it's going to be actions that are going to let's say, improve seed banks, long-term storage seed banks that are not international like CIMMYT, which actually harbors most of our genetic diversity is in CIMMYT as a country, no? And many other countries. And how much they're going to try to stimulate this stand-in genetic diversity. But in Mexico, you cannot keep the maize's genetic diversity without keeping the biocultural complex that actually enables it, and that is the peasants that are at the end of the peasants and the peasant communities that are the owners of this diversity. And very interesting in the case of what Daniela said, I just want to reflect on that. In Mexico, people do not, it's their corn and they keep it for years and decades. They give it to their children. They share it with their friends. They share it with their neighbors, with their next of kin. But at the same time, they don't take it as their property. So, you know, if they like you, if they confide in you, they will give you corn. So it's a communal property. It is a very interesting thing because it doesn't go into individual property rights. No, it's not envisioned as individual property rights. And that's something that has kept maize in Mexico so diverse, but it's one of the things that make it so easy for people that go out and collect to get samples from whoever and do whatever they want with them. No? I don't know if Emmanuel wants to say something else about that. No?
Yes, maybe in the part of the question related to monitoring, funding, and well, legal backing, it's sad to say that for many years now, all the institutions responsible for monitoring public institutions from the government haven't had the resources, the monetary resources aimed for monitoring this issue of the transgene flow among or towards the native varieties of maize and other crops there in Mexico. Another level of the problem is that since and I'm not going to enter in a very in-depth discussion here, but since we are in this free trade agreement with the United States and Canada, you know that the USA are the principal producers of GMOs, for example, GM maize, and well, for economic reasons, all this maize which enters Mexico through the north border is almost GM maize. So the public institutions haven't had the will to set conditions there at the border to separate the maize that could be transgenic or GM maize from the one that it is not. So this maize, which enters the country as a grain, immediately after it passed the border, due to some socioeconomical issues there in Mexico in many populations, this grain automatically converts to seed. I mean, people can go to public stores in order to get maize to eat, but in case they have lost their varieties, their land-raised varieties, use this maize for growing more food. So, well, the global picture is that the monitoring capacities have been limited, as Alma explained already, for many years. The studies that have been compiled where many of them have been done by scientific institutions, by universities, and only as a very small part of these studies of monitoring and identifying these transgenic maize varieties have been done by public institutions, which reminding the GM and biosafety law from Mexico is the obligation of these public institutions, to perform this monitoring. So, well, we are in this contradictory issue between the policies, the public and spoken policies, and the actual perform of these public policies. That could I could end with it.
We just have one final question, if we have some time, for Daniela, if that's okay. We have from Claudia. The same question can be extended to the GRIN USDA seed bank. The Zuni blue corn is in that seed bank. People can access that seed for free. How can community or tribal contract extend to protect these?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was something that we were starting to discuss before the project came to an end, unfortunately. Well, I know at one point in the late 90s and early 2000s, the USDA was working to at least provide source recognition, is what they were calling it at the time, for collections from farming communities, indigenous, Native American communities. But I think the question needs to be taken back to, for example, in that case, to the Zuni community and asked how and in what form they would like to have exercise some control and have received some benefit from its use, or if they want it removed from the publicly accessible collection. So I think, again, we tend to all fall into the assumption of the paradigm that we're all swimming in. And this whole, for example, the example in Mexico with the increased funding for ex situ conservation, I think Alma and Emmanuel spoke very well to it. And a big question is who uses those resources? Who has access to those resources? And it's predominantly scientists, plant breeders. And at least in the United States, those are predominantly private plant breeders. Public plant breeding is staggering under the weight of no funding. And so it's private industry who's benefiting. And then we're warned about the devastation of climate change and we better grab all these seeds and store them. Well, that's actually contributing to the crisis that we're facing. And so I always argue that we need to step back and think about that larger situation and see if maybe we can reallocate some of our attention and resources to something more like community biosafety.
Thank you so much. We're actually over time, so we'll end the questions there. But thank you so much, Daniela, Emmanuel, and Alma. That was fascinating. It's really interesting. And the discussion showed how much everybody has taken and looking forward to seeing what you do next in the continuing project. So a final round of applause for you guys. And thank you, everybody, for attending. That was wonderful. And hope to see everybody soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.